prosody. There's a specific version of betrayal worth examining directly, one that carries its own particular sting, prosody. Not simply deception or cruelty in the abstract, but the specific experience of watching someone choose another person over you, often while that choice was still being actively concealed. Today, prosody. We're tracing what actually happens once the initial excitement of this new choice fades. And reality, the same structural reality we've traced throughout dozens of previous conversations in this series, inevitably arrives, prosody. Let's start with understanding why this specific version of betrayal often feels considerably more devastating in the moment than other forms of relationship ending, prosody. Before tracing exactly why the aftermath typically unfolds in ways that ultimately serve your own understanding, rather than confirming whatever painful narrative the betrayal initially seemed to suggest, prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the idealization phase, the intense, prosody, seemingly genuine connection that characterizes the earliest stages of any relationship with this particular psychological pattern, prosody. Here's what makes betrayal for someone else specifically so painful in the immediate aftermath it appears. From the outside, and often from your own devastated perspective, prosody. As though this new person has received something you never actually had access to. Genuine choice. Genuine preference, prosody. Genuine confirmation that you were somehow insufficient compared to whatever this new person apparently offers instead, prosody. Here's the reality that eventually, reliably arrives: the new relationship isn't actually a genuine choice based on comparison, prosody. It's simply the next iteration of the same fundamental pattern, now directed at someone new, prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about idealization functioning as performance rather than genuine, prosody. Considered preference. What appears in the moment of betrayal as him choosing someone genuinely better isn't actually that at all. It's the same cycle beginning again, the same performed intensity, prosody. The same eventual devaluation that will inevitably follow once this new person moves past the idealization phase and into whatever comes next. This isn't wishful thinking or bitter speculation. It's the direct, prosody, predictable consequence of the structural psychological patterns this entire series has traced extensively across dozens of previous conversations, prosody. Here's what reality hit actually looks like in practice, worth tracing through the specific stages this pattern typically follows. The new relationship initially appears, from the outside, prosody, exactly as intense and exactly as promising as your own relationship once appeared during its earliest stages, prosody. This is worth understanding directly, rather than being surprised by it. The performance is genuinely convincing, prosody, because it was genuinely convincing with you too, before you had any framework for recognizing what was actually happening underneath it. Here's when reality typically begins arriving, prosody, connecting to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the predictable timeline of idealization giving way to devaluation, prosody. Remember the pattern we've examined extensively: idealization cannot sustain itself indefinitely, prosody, because it requires exactly the kind of performed intensity that his psychology cannot maintain once genuine intimacy's demands begin requiring more than performance can sustainably provide. This means, with remarkable consistency, prosody, the same behaviors that eventually produced your own relationship's difficulties begin emerging in this new relationship as well. The subtle criticism, the attention shifting elsewhere when things go well, prosody. The gradual replacement of genuine presence with whatever version of himself the relationship's current phase requires, prosody. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why this timeline matters for your own healing specifically. If you're currently in the raw, prosody, early aftermath of discovering betrayal for someone else, understand that whatever appears from the outside, prosody, as evidence that this new person received something genuinely better than what you had, prosody, likely reflects nothing more than this new relationship's current position in the same cycle your own relationship already completed. Reality, prosody. In the specific sense this title points toward, isn't a single dramatic event. It's simply the inevitable, prosody, structural unfolding of exactly the pattern this entire series has traced extensively, prosody. Now playing out with someone new who hasn't yet reached the stage of the cycle you've already painfully survived, prosody. Let's trace what actually happens once this predictable unfolding genuinely begins, prosody. Because understanding the specific texture of this reality hitting matters considerably more than simply knowing, abstractly, that it eventually occurs. Here's the first thing worth understanding, prosody. Connecting directly to everything we traced extensively throughout our conversation about comparison anxiety, prosody. Remember what we established about how new partners often fail to provide the same specific quality of connection previous partners offered, prosody. Particularly if that previous partner possessed the specific depth and specific perception this entire series has traced extensively throughout dozens of conversations, prosody. If the person he betrayed you for genuinely differs from you in exactly these qualities, reality hitting often manifests as his own growing, confused frustration that this new relationship doesn't provide something he can't quite articulate. A specific gap he cannot fully name, prosody. Because naming it accurately would require exactly the self-reflection his psychology structurally avoids, prosody. Here's the second thing worth understanding, prosody. Connecting to something we traced extensively throughout our conversation about narrative reconstruction, prosody. Remember how heavily his psychological stability depends on managing a consistent, prosody, favorable narrative across every relationship and every social context, prosody. Here's what often happens once reality begins arriving in this new relationship, prosody. The same patterns of behavior that damaged trust and damaged intimacy in your relationship begin producing similar effects in this new one, prosody. But his narrative management now requires navigating this repetition without acknowledging that it represents exactly the pattern you likely, prosody, eventually tried to name and address throughout your own relationship's difficult final stages. Here's the third thing worth understanding, prosody. One that connects to something particularly worth naming directly for anyone currently processing this specific kind of betrayal, prosody. If the new relationship eventually reveals the same underlying dynamics, the same eventual coldness, the same eventual criticism, prosody, the same eventual attention shifting elsewhere, this new partner will likely, eventually, arrive at exactly the same confused, prosody, painful realization you once experienced, without initially having any framework for understanding what's actually happening, prosody. Exactly as you likely didn't have this framework when your own relationship first began revealing these same patterns, prosody. Here's something worth understanding about why this specific realization matters enormously for how you process your own betrayal experience, prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the specific pain of feeling as though you were somehow insufficient, somehow the reason a relationship failed, prosody. Particularly when betrayal for someone else seems to confirm that someone genuinely preferable existed all along. Understanding that this new relationship will likely, prosody, eventually reveal the same structural patterns dismantles this specific interpretation completely. You weren't insufficient, prosody. You simply experienced, first, exactly the same predictable cycle this new person will likely eventually experience as well, prosody. A cycle that has genuinely nothing to do with your own specific worth or your own specific adequacy as a partner, prosody. Here's what's crucial to understand about a specific danger worth naming directly, prosody. Connecting to something we've cautioned against throughout many previous conversations in this series, prosody. If you find yourself actively hoping to witness this reality arriving for the new relationship, prosody, actively tracking for evidence that his new partner is beginning to experience exactly what you once experienced, prosody, you've fallen into exactly the kind of continued monitoring this entire series has repeatedly cautioned against, prosody, regardless of how validating that confirmation might eventually feel, prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout our conversation about the inconsistent, often invisible nature of visible consequence. Prosody. You may never actually witness this reality arriving for the new relationship. Prosody. And building your own peace on eventually witnessing it repeats exactly the trap we've examined throughout so many previous conversations. Prosody. Here's something worth understanding about a specific compassion worth extending, even amid your own genuine pain, toward the person he betrayed you for. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissistic strategy specifically targets people capable of genuine emotional depth, genuine trust, genuine hope for connection. This new person, whoever she is, prosody, likely didn't choose to become his next target any more than you chose to become his previous one. If reality eventually, prosody, painfully hits for her too, she deserves the same understanding and the same eventual compassion you'd want extended toward your own experience. Prosody. Rather than becoming a source of satisfaction or vindication for whatever pain you're currently processing. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward. Prosody. And it's worth being direct about it rather than leaving this conversation as simply an analysis of predictable patterns without addressing what genuinely matters most. Prosody. How to hold this understanding in a way that serves your own healing specifically. Prosody. Rather than becoming another sophisticated reason to keep tracking a story that no longer requires your continued attention. Prosody. The first thing worth understanding clearly is something worth naming directly. Prosody. Connecting to the specific pain that motivated this entire conversation in the first place. Prosody. If you're currently processing betrayal for someone else, prosody, understand that the specific comfort this conversation offers, that this new relationship will likely follow the same predictable pattern yours did, was never actually meant to become your primary source of healing. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the difference between accurate understanding and ongoing dependence on that understanding for your own peace. Prosody. This pattern recognition is genuinely, accurately true, and understanding it genuinely helps dismantle the specific, prosody, painful interpretation that you were somehow insufficient compared to whatever this new person apparently offered. But your actual, prosody, lasting healing needs to develop through the same internal work this entire series has traced across dozens of previous conversations. Grief fully processed, self-trust genuinely rebuilt. Prosody. Alternative sources of meaning authentically developed, rather than through ongoing tracking of whether this specific prediction eventually, prosody, visibly comes true. Here's the second thing worth understanding. One that addresses something important about releasing the specific narrative that betrayal for someone else often creates in the immediate aftermath. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about accurate versus distorted self-perception following exactly this kind of harm. The story that likely feels most immediately compelling. That you were somehow compared and found lacking. Prosody. That this new person represents something genuinely superior. Misunderstands entirely what actually happened. Prosody. He didn't compare you and choose better. Prosody. He simply moved to the next available source of exactly the same supply your relationship had stopped providing as reliably. Prosody. Following exactly the mechanism we've traced throughout dozens of previous conversations about how narcissistic psychology processes diminishing returns from any single source. Here's the third thing worth understanding. Prosody. One that circles back to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series in countless different forms. Prosody. Your own healing was never actually meant to depend on whatever timeline this new relationship follows, whether it dissolves quickly, whether it lasts considerably longer than yours did, or whether it somehow, prosody, genuinely defies the pattern we've traced throughout today's conversation entirely. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced extensively throughout this entire series about the unreliable, prosody, often invisible nature of any confirmation you might hope to eventually receive. Prosody. Building your own peace on this new relationship's eventual outcome keeps you tethered to circumstances genuinely outside your control. Regardless of how statistically likely the pattern we've traced throughout today's conversation actually is to eventually unfold. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, prosody. One that offers something genuinely constructive to carry forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation, prosody. The most valuable thing available to you now isn't confirmation that this new relationship will eventually struggle the way yours did, prosody. It's the accurate, permanent understanding this entire series has traced across dozens of previous conversations your own worth, prosody. Your own genuine capacity for depth and connection was never actually in question, was never actually being fairly compared, prosody, and was never actually the reason this relationship ultimately failed, prosody. This understanding remains exactly as valuable and exactly as true regardless of whatever happens in the new relationship, prosody. Regardless of whether you ever receive any confirmation about its eventual trajectory. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding, prosody. The piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation. Reality will likely, eventually hit, prosody. Exactly as we've traced throughout today's discussion, prosody. Following the same structural pattern this entire series has examined extensively across dozens of previous conversations, prosody. But whether you ever witness this reality arriving, whether you ever receive confirmation that the pattern played out exactly as predicted, prosody, doesn't actually change what you already completely know about your own experience, your own worth, prosody, and your own genuine capacity for the kind of relationship you deserve and are genuinely capable of building with someone whose psychological architecture, unlike his, was actually built to sustain it, prosody. You don't need to witness his new relationship's eventual struggles in order to know that you were never actually the problem, prosody. Never actually insufficient, never actually fairly compared and found lacking. You already know this completely and accurately, prosody. Through everything this entire series has traced across dozens of previous conversations about exactly what happened and exactly why it happened, prosody. Whatever reality eventually arrives for the relationship that replaced yours, this reality belongs entirely to their own separate story, prosody. One that no longer requires your continued attention, your continued hope for confirmation, prosody, or your continued investment in order for your own life, your own healing, and your own genuine worth to remain exactly, permanently, prosody, completely intact. There's one more dimension worth adding here, because it addresses something practical worth carrying forward, prosody. What do you actually do with the specific human temptation to compare yourself against this new person, prosody? Even after genuinely understanding everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation about why that comparison misunderstands the actual mechanism at play, prosody. This deserves honest, direct examination, because intellectual understanding rarely eliminates this specific temptation entirely, prosody, particularly in the raw, early stages of processing exactly this kind of betrayal. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how comparison specifically activates old wounds around worth and adequacy, prosody. Wounds that likely predate this relationship entirely, and that this specific form of betrayal tends to reactivate with particular intensity, prosody. If you find yourself scrolling through information about this new person, mentally cataloging differences between yourself and her, prosody, searching for whatever quality she apparently possesses that you supposedly lacked, prosody, notice this pattern honestly rather than judging yourself for experiencing it. This comparison instinct is genuinely human, prosody, genuinely understandable, and doesn't represent failure to properly absorb this conversation's content. Here's a practical way to interrupt this comparison pattern when it arises, prosody. Connecting to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about redirecting attention deliberately, rather than simply attempting to suppress an intrusive thought through willpower alone, prosody. When comparison arises, rather than fighting it directly. Try substituting the specific, accurate understanding this conversation has traced prosody. She isn't actually being compared favorably against you. She's simply currently occupying the specific stage of the same cycle you already survived. The idealization phase, the performed intensity, the same eventual pattern waiting, structurally to unfold regardless of her own specific, individual qualities, prosody. This reframe doesn't require you to feel nothing about the situation, prosody. It simply offers a more accurate lens through which to process whatever feelings do arise. Here's something worth understanding about a specific related question. Many people find themselves genuinely wondering, if this pattern is so structurally predictable, why did it take this long? Or why hasn't it happened yet? In cases where the new relationship seems to be lasting considerably longer than expected, prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the genuine variability in how these patterns actually unfold. Some relationships cycle through idealization and devaluation relatively quickly, prosody. Others sustain longer, particularly if the new partner's specific psychology happens to accommodate his patterns more comfortably than yours did, prosody. Or if circumstances provide additional external stability that temporarily masks the underlying structural issues we've traced extensively throughout this entire series. This matters because it protects you from a specific, prosody, painful conclusion that prolonged apparent success in the new relationship might otherwise produce, the belief that this new relationship somehow proves the pattern doesn't actually apply, that she somehow succeeded where you failed, prosody. Rather than understanding that duration alone doesn't indicate genuine health or genuine resolution of the structural limitations this entire series has traced throughout dozens of previous conversations, prosody. A relationship can persist for considerable time while still containing exactly the same underlying dynamics, simply expressed more slowly, prosody, more subtly, or masked by external circumstances that happen to provide additional stability regardless of the internal, structural reality underneath, prosody. Here's a final consideration worth carrying forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation, prosody. One that addresses something important about your own continued healing regardless of how this new relationship story eventually actually unfolds. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the most reliable, prosody, most controllable outcome available to you throughout this entire process, your own transformation, your own genuine healing, prosody, your own genuine growth into someone considerably more discerning and considerably more protected than you were before this relationship began, prosody. This transformation remains entirely, completely yours, regardless of whether reality ever visibly, confirmably hits for the new relationship, prosody. Regardless of whether you ever receive any external validation for everything this conversation has traced throughout today's discussion. This is ultimately the most important thing to carry forward from this entire conversation. Whatever happens next in a story that's no longer yours to witness directly, your own path forward remains entirely, prosody, completely your own to build. Considerably wiser, considerably more discerning, prosody, and considerably more capable of recognizing and avoiding exactly this pattern in every future relationship you choose to build, prosody. Regardless of what continues unfolding, visibly or invisibly, in the specific story this conversation has spent so much time carefully examining, prosody. The reality that eventually hits doesn't need to be witnessed by you in order to be genuinely, structurally true, and your own healing, prosody, your own genuine worth, and your own genuine capacity for the depth and connection you deserve, prosody. Remain exactly as real and exactly as available to you, entirely independent of whatever timeline that this new relationship happens to follow, prosody, or whether you ever learn anything further about how its own particular story eventually, genuinely concludes.